just before we start. One, as I mentioned earlier to Ilya, I sometimes have audio issues with my laptop recently. If at any point I become inaudible or my voice gets choppy and unclear, write so in the chat and I will join from my phone as well, and I'll just use my phone's mic to fix it. Secondly, if at any point you want to ask a question, you don't have to wait for the end or anything. Just either write in the chat that you have a question or raise hand with the raise hand function on Zoom so that we can coordinate who asks when, and I can mute while you speak and you can mute while I speak, because if we both unmute at once, it will be echoey and annoying. And I think that's mostly it. Let's dive right into this. So we are going to discuss judging today. My understanding is that we have mixed levels of experience in judging in this room. Hence, I will start mostly out of scratch to cover some of the basics, and I will gradually try and get to the more advanced material as the workshop develops. It will be impossible for me to cover every single component of judging in a single 1.5 hour workshop. So I do recommend that this is not your only source of learning. I highly recommend the Korea Judge Training Program for those who have not yet completed it. It is much more thorough and rigorous, but I will try and mostly focus this workshop on what, based on the questions that you sent me in the form, seems to be more of your area of what you want me to focus on or explain. What will we discuss today? We will discuss mostly how to evaluate claims in debate in general, what to credit, what not to credit, what extent do we credit each claim, and so on. We will discuss comparisons and how to make them. We will discuss principles of adjudication, such as holistic adjudication and so on, or comparative adjudication, and what do they mean. We'll chat briefly about note-taking and how to write when you judge. And lastly, the last few slides of this workshop will be dedicated to specifically close calls and how to decide in close calls, because most of the questions I got for this workshop were based on closed calls of various sorts. Let's start. What is persuasive in debate? We generally look at three main metrics of persuasiveness: likelihood, importance, sometimes referred to as impact, although I think it is a slightly less accurate term for reasons I'll shortly elaborate, and relevance. Let's understand one by one what each of these components mean, and then how do we combine them into evaluating an argument. Likelihood is the answer to the question of, is the argument true? So, for example, if the motion is, this house would legalize all drugs, and proposition makes the argument that there is a black market today that we need to resolve, and if we legalize all drugs, then we fix the problem of the black market. The likelihood analysis is every part of the argument that aims to prove specifically that it is true that we have a black market today. So this can be because people have an incentive to continue this trade because it has a lot of potential money in it, because people are addicted and just the fact that you ban it is not stopping them, because it's too hard to enforce, etc. All of this pertains to the likelihood of the claim. Notice how it is not a binary. It is very, very rare for arguments to just be true or untrue. More often, they have an extent of truth to them. They are likely or unlikely or more likely or less likely to be true. So, for example, with the black market, it is almost trivial that it exists. But the more analysis given for the likelihood of it, the more we can assume that it is large, commonplace, that it is hard to prevent it, and we can just try and make the ban better enforced, and so on. So this is the scale of likelihood. Importance is, why do we care if the argument is indeed proven? So in this case, it is quite trivial. This will be the impact component of the argument. So in a black market, every analysis on why the black market is bad, such as you can have drugs that are not well regulated there, and therefore people are more able to put inside it materials that are highly addictive that you are not aware of, or it is very often a common place for other areas of crime, because when you have a black market, most of the revenue from drugs goes to criminal organizations that then do other illegal activities, such as trading weapons and so on. This would be the importance element. One small note, importance doesn't necessarily have to be an input. It is usually an input. Importance of an argument can also be a principal element. For example, if I argue we should legalize all drugs because people have a basic right to choose what to put into their body, this might have no impact. There's no harm I'm going to prove here by not letting people do this. But my explanation on why it is important that people have this autonomy is still feeling the importance component of this analysis. Lastly, relevance. How relevant is the argument I am making to the debate? So again, there is a binary understanding of relevance, but also a more complicated spectrum understanding of relevance. The binary element of relevance would be, is it on clash or off clash? For example, if the motion is, this house would allow the use of torture when fighting against terror organizations, if opposition runs the argument that torture is ineffective as a tool because people will just lie in order to get out of the torture, or tell you anything you want to know even if it's wrong and therefore it's bad, I can answer this is off clash. Why is this off clash? Why is this irrelevant to the question of whether or not we should allow torture? Because the question isn't should we use it, to which the question whether or not it is effective would have been relevant. The question is rather, should we allow it? If it is ineffective, or in the instances that it is not effective, countries would just not use it because there's no need. So much like we don't ban the use of toy guns, even though toy guns are clearly ineffective, we don't need to ban torture just because it's ineffective. There needs to be a stronger principal reason to oppose it. So this can be an example of off-clash. However, relevance can also be a spectrum, as in how much is the claim relevant to the specific debate at hand. For example, let's say the motion is something around the lines of, this house, as parents, would teach their kids to disobey authority. Say that opposition makes an argument around the lines of, if we teach our kids to disobey authority, they would not listen to legal and moral codes of society, and this would make them immoral actors that might harm others in society. Proposition will not be able to say this is off clash because we as parents only care about our children. Because as we all know, in actor motions, we do care also about moral incentives. And presumably, most parents do care about their children being moral kids. However, they might say something like, sure, we care about this, but we care about this less than we do about the benefit of our own child. That would mean the argument is relevant. It is somewhat less relevant than other arguments that are more directly tied to our interest. Another example of this could be this house as Argentina would significantly reduce its emissions production. Let's consider two arguments in this debate. One argument is if Argentina reduces its emissions, this will help citizens of Argentina be healthier and more protected from pollution, because the emissions directly impact everyone in the surrounding that breathes them through the air or drinks them through the water and develops cancerous diseases as a result. A second argument may be if Argentina reduces its emissions, it contributes to the reduction of emissions in the global effort to combat climate change. And this is how we reduce climate change. On face value, the impact of the second argument sounds bigger because it is impacting more people across the world and fighting more essentially the problem of climate change. However, I can easily say the first argument might be more relevant. Why? Because the extent of difference the motion makes on the world when only Argentina, one country, changes its emissions is small. And the extent of difference it makes directly on the citizens of Argentina is large. Hence, the first argument is more relevant. This is to say, an argument can be relevant and still be less relevant than other arguments. So to summarize what I've said, we evaluate arguments based on their likelihood, their importance, and their relevance, and all three of these components are not binary components, but are on a spectrum. We try to assess them comparatively. I am shortly going to discuss then how we compare between arguments based on them. So, the simple part is, if we have a direct comparison on direct components, it becomes fairly easy. Say, both sides agree on the importance, the impact they want to reach. They only disagree on the likelihood component. In which case, I only need to compare who had better analysis to prove their likelihood. That is an easy comparison. What do we do, however, when we have competing arguments that are ranking differently on each of these three scales? Consider, for example, a very common situation. One team proves an argument to be very, very likely, but of relatively low impact. It is likely, but it is soft. Another team proves an argument that is very unlikely, but is very high impact in the case that it does happen. How do we compare between them? What do you guys think? What is more important, likelihood, importance, or relevance when we need to compare competing metrics? Anyone has any thoughts? Let's see the chat. Okay, I'm seeing two people saying relevance. I'm seeing one person saying likelihood. So here's the real answer. It depends. There is no clear-cut right answer to this. Sometimes an argument that has high likelihood with relatively low impact should win an argument that has low likelihood with relatively high impact. As an example, if the motion is this house would renew the Iranian deal between the US and Iran, which is basically a denuclearization deal or a deal that Iran stops its nuclearization program in exchange for the West lifting most of its sanctions. Proposition might say something around the lines of, if we lift the sanctions and Iran, therefore, stops developing their nuclear programs, we have two extremely likely impacts. One, civilians in Iran would have much better life quality because we reduce and we lift the sanctions. And two, we make Iran stop its nuclearization program. Opposition might give an argument such as Iran might still develop its nuclear plan in secret. And when it develops it in secret, it might make it much more dangerous when we lift the sanctions because it has more money without the sanctions and more capacity to advance it farther. Now, in this case, the advantage of proposition is a likely benefit of we reduce the development of nuclear program and we inherently make the lives of Iranian people better. And opposition has a somewhat less likely but very high impact case of what happens if Iran is able to develop its nukes much faster. If opposition is losing on likelihood, in this case, it is likely to lose the debate. Why? Because proposition's argument is not just showing better likelihood, but is not far behind opposition on impact. Because opposition's impact is Iran develops nukes faster, but they still develop nukes on both sides. They just do it faster and up. Prop's impact is we might prevent Iran from developing nukes at all. And in this case, having the higher likelihood, even if the slightly lower harm, because faster nukes scare us more than slow to develop nukes, because they both have very high impact, we are likely to err on the side of likelihood. In contrast, if an argument is very high impact and is less likely than another argument that is somewhat more likely but much lower impact, then we might flip our call. For example, if opposition were to prove it is extremely likely Iran will successfully develop its nukes if we lift the sanctions and we'll have no way of knowing it breaches the agreement, and proposition proves it is even more likely still that we would be able to uplift the standard of living of Iranian people. Because the chance of a nuclear war might be like 80% on opposition side, but we still have 100% certainty of improving people's life quality. I would say most of us would still prefer 100% of somewhat lower life quality than 80% of nuclear war. Let's simplify this now from the example and understand what we mean. Here is a visual representation of how these three metrics look like. Each case needs to have all three. Now, when we evaluate the strength of a case, what we effectively evaluate is likelihood times importance times relevance. Meaning, if you know the term utility from things such as statistics and so on, that would be likelihood times importance. That would be when we evaluate, is it worth it for us to take a risk for better gains? In the real world, if you ask yourself, is it worth it to take a risk for better gains? The answer would obviously be, it depends. How high is the risk and how high is the gain? When the gain is higher than the risk, we would usually opt for taking it. And when the risk is higher than the gain, we would usually opt not to. This is why most people do support investing, even though investments has some risk, because it has more chances of profiting than losing still. But most people would be critical of gambling because the risk is much higher relative to the gain. In other words, despite the fact that we are comparing apples and oranges here, like one team is winning on the metric of likelihood and one team is winning on the metric of importance, we can still ask ourselves the funny question of which apple, or is the apple apple-ier or is the orange orangier? To translate, is one team winning the other on likelihood by a large or small margin? And is the other team winning on importance by a large or small margin? If both competing arguments are likely, but one is 10% likelier, but the 10% likelier argument has 50% weaker impact, we would still prefer the higher argument because the margin of difference in impact is bigger than the margin of difference in likelihood. So in our mind, when we are listening to arguments, we are trying to constantly evaluate not just whether they are, in a binary sense, likelier or less likely, more or less important, more or less relevant than the other side. We are trying to ask ourselves how much more relevant, how much more likely, how much more important each argument is. Now, of course, there are still situations where this will not be enough to resolve it. If one team is very much higher on likelihood, but very much lower on impact, and the other is very much higher on impact and very much lower on likelihood, we would still need to defer to other methods. But at least in most cases, when we don't get to the very close calls, which I'll get to more at the end of this workshop, we are usually able to identify extent difference in how much each team wins on each of these three spectrums. So to cut it short, there is no heuristic or all-applying rule that says likelihood or importance or relevance is always more important than the other parameters. The question is always, what is the extent of difference between the teams on each of these spectrums? And when we sum all of them together, who ends up having the biggest case, biggest in the sense of if we were to calculate the volume of this box in the end. Is this clear? Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. I'm assuming this is no questions, so let's move on. The globally informed voter. The globally informed voter is a fiction. It is made up for the purposes of debate. Do not conflate it with the real life globally informed voter. This is a common mistake I've seen many people do. The globally informed voter is very clearly defined in the judge manual and has the following components. It is defined by its knowledge, by its beliefs, and by its logic. 1. In terms of beliefs, the globally informed voter has very few beliefs. They are roughly a very ambivalent person, a radical centrist, willing to be convinced by almost anything. They do, however, hold some baseline assumptions about the world if these assumptions are in the consensus. What does a consensus mean? Consensus is something that virtually no one disagrees with. Almost everyone you would ask on the street would agree on. This means the globally informed voter does believe a statement such as, dead babies are bad. The globally informed voter does not have an opinion on whether or not Trump is better than Biden, because this is not a consensus. This is controversial. You might think there's a majority leaning in one direction or another, but that doesn't matter. It needs to be a consensus for the globally informed voter to believe in it. This is why, if someone makes an argument in a debate, such as, and this is how, if you oppose the motion, Trump would win, this is not a harm, unless they prove it to be a harm. The globally informed voter is not afraid of Trump. They have no opinions of Trump. They have no opinions of anything that is controversial. Unless, of course, the motion is explicitly defined, say, from the Democratic Party's perspective, which is a different story. So the globally informed voter is neither left-wing nor right-wing. They only believe in what is the consensus. They are also having a spectrum of consensual beliefs, meaning the more an argument strays far from the consensus, the less the globally informed voter will be willing to believe it. And the closer it is to the consensus, the more a globally informed voter will be willing to believe it. Say, it is significantly easier to convince the globally informed voter that Trump is bad than to convince the globally informed voter that all right-wing is bad. Because Trump is bad, while not being a consensus, is closer to the consensus, is a belief shared by more people, is more intuitive than the statement, everything right-wing is always bad. Similarly, while abortions are controversial, and you are able to convince the globally informed voter that abortions are good, it will be much harder to convince the globally informed voter that killing babies is good. Because abortions are good is controversial, but killing babies is significantly more controversial. The importance of this is in understanding that when we assess the three metrics we discussed earlier of likelihood, importance, and relevance, we don't make this comparison in a vacuum. We always make this comparison based on the first premise. The first premises we believe in the debate are everything in the consensus. And this means that if a team chooses deliberately an argument that is less intuitive, that is more controversial, they will have a higher burden of proof to proving it. This is not us placing asymmetrical burdens on them. This is us deferring to what the globally informed voter finds compelling, and the more intuitive a claim is, the less analysis they would require for it. To be clear, the globally informed voter is still willing to buy anything. You can theoretically convince it that killing babies is good. It would just be extremely hard, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone manage to do it. But this is still important because some debates are deliberately questioning things that are believed to be a wide consensus, such as if we have a motion like, this House believes that there should be no limitations on free speech ever, this is obviously going against the wide consensus that expressions such as incitement, like literally, here are instructions and an address of where this person lives and where you can buy a gun, shoot this person, should be illegal. So this is a consensus proposition has to break. We can still be convinced of it. They would just have a very high burden to break it. Crucially, the globally informed citizen is not an average debater. They are specifically an average international informed voter. This means, one, a lot of biases that are common to the debating community as a community of students that are young and educated and therefore often more liberal or progressive are not true for the globally informed voter. The globally informed voter does not think feminism is good. They also don't think feminism is bad. I don't think most people in the real world are either feminist or anti-feminist. The globally informed voter does not have an opinion on whether or not feminism is good until you convince them of it. Similarly, the globally informed voter does not have a Western bias, despite the fact that many judges have a Western bias. So the globally informed voter does not automatically believe that a US dominance in the global arena is preferable to a Chinese dominance, just because it seems to be the consensus in the West. Many people across the globe think that China would be a better actor to lead the global world, and this is fine. We need to convince and analyze which actor would be better for the global arena. This is in terms of beliefs. In terms of knowledge, the globally informed voter is extremely wide in the breadth of their knowledge and extremely shallow in the depth of their knowledge. Meaning, they read global newspapers and they read every single headline on the international newspapers. If something comes up in any headline, doesn't matter about which country or whether it's politics, economics, IR, or anything else, the globally informed voter knows it. However, they don't read the article. They don't go into depth. They don't have a degree. This means they have shallow understanding of the world. So, for example, a globally informed voter should know that currently the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is Keir Starmer, because it's been on headline news and they're expected to know this. They should not know who is number 23 on the Tories list for parliament, because this is not something that anyone who didn't deep dive into it should know. Lastly, the globally informed voter is logically infallible. This is in contrast to the global average voter. The actual real world voter is very much prone to many biases, to demagoguery, to slogans that sound good. The globally informed voter in the context of debate does not buy into logical fallacies. You could not convince them with things that often politicians convince voters with in the real world. They still need to abide by perfect logic. We will try and judge the debate as though we are the globally informed voter in order to avoid subjective biases. Are there any questions on the globally informed voter or how we use it to evaluate material in debate? So I think this is a good question in the chat. Is democracy overall good a consensus? I think this kind of falls into the question of what you define as democracy. But I would posit that actually, if you ask the globally informed voter, the vast majority of people, to an almost consensus extent, would agree that democracy is good, which is why, even in systems that are not democratic, they usually have a pretense of democracy. See the Democratic Republic of North Korea. They often have Fox elections. They still care about representation. If you look at, for example, Vietnam, that doesn't have a democracy and only has one party, they still care about many democratic values of representation, which is why there's still a lot of pressure on the ruling party to serve the people and not just do whatever it wants. I think the Western bias is not in saying democracy is overall good. I think that part is admitted by almost everyone. I think the Western bias, which is not part of the globally informed voters' beliefs, is in two things about democracy. One, in finding democracy to be infallible. I think the globally informed voter is very happy to believe that there are flaws to democracy and there can be better systems than democracy. Secondly, I think the Western bias would be in valorizing democracy above other values. For example, if we look at the recent Indian elections, there are many claims that were made about the implication that the elections in India had for democracy. by giving accountability and restraint to the BJP now that they have to form a coalition and don't have a supermajority and so on. The fact that having more democracy in India is generally good should not be very controversial. However, stating that democracy is the most important value, that we should prioritize the candidate that is better for Indian democracy even at the expense of Indian economics, is already a bias. This is not something the globally informed voter necessarily believes in. And they might easily prefer a stronger, bigger government with less checks and balances, even though it's less democratic, because they might argue for many reasons it is better for the economy and stability. So democracy being an overall good, I don't think is that much far from the consensus. Democracy being the most good or more important than other values is already not a consensus. Does this answer the question? Okay. Let's move on. Holistic adjudication. Given everything that is said in the debate, we need to decide whether we accept or reject the proposal. This means we do not discriminate between content based on how it is branded. I don't care if a piece of content is in an argument, in a rebuttal, in a weighing, in a framing, in a POI, or in anything else. Content is content. This is important for many things pertaining to evaluating content in debate. For example, evaluating what an extension is. If bottom half only added rebuttals and have no new constructive material, they could theoretically still win their top half, even though they only added rebuttal or quote-unquote mitigatory content. Because all content is equal, we only ask what is stronger in the context of this debate, which is why, for example, if OG has a strong constructive, OO has an even stronger constructive and wins OG on a direct weighing, showing that their constructive is more important than OG's, and CG annihilates OO's constructive in rebuttal, CG should win over OG because their contribution to the debate by annihilating the stronger OO material has become more important to deciding who wins than the OG contribution of just giving constructive material. So no heuristic of they only gave rebuttals is in itself enough to weigh a debate. It is true that if you only give rebuttal, often it puts a threshold of how good it has to be in order to win. Mostly because the value of rebuttal is always comparative. If CG were to give good rebuttal to OO, but not enough to take them down, it would be harder to place them over OG. Because if they don't win the threat that won OG, it is harder to say clearly why their negative contribution is more important than OG's positive contribution. But the fact that they had only rebuttal and no constructive extension alone cannot be a reason in itself for why they lose. Similarly, content often hides in material that is branded differently. Oftentimes, teams will give benefits, constructive benefits, in a rebuttal. Say a rebuttal that flips the other argument and actually shows that we co-opt their harms. Even though it is branded as a rebuttal, I would still credit them for proving de facto a constructive benefit in the rebuttal, because all material is judged equally no matter how it is branded. Similarly, often teams integrate rebuttals in their arguments, and then, even if they didn't give direct refutation to the other side, if the analysis sufficiently engages the original claim, I would still consider it as though they took down the argument, because they don't have to do it through direct refutation. They can do it through their own analysis. The caveat here is, of course, The analysis or the engagement within the argument has to be sufficiently engaging the other side. It is not enough that we have any competing analysis to say that we took down the arguments from the other side. We need the better analysis, the winning analysis. Lastly, it also means that we consider POIs and content given in the POI as equal to content given in side speeches, which is part of why it's so important to track POIs. I see so many judges not writing down what people say in POIs. This is despite the fact that often people condense a lot of efficient material in POIs. In their speeches, they're usually having a lot of redundancies and inefficiencies because it's long and they get blabbery. In a POI, they think carefully about wording to get a lot of content across in 15 seconds. We shouldn't ignore it. We should notice what they say. And we should wait and consider it in the OA. And good OAs should also address what was said in POIs when making comparisons. It also means, by the way, that things said in POIs can be used by whips and do not count as new material. So, for example, if I am opposition whip and I gave a POI to the Prime Minister where I said an argument, I can refer back to it in my speech, even if my member speaker never said a word about it, because I already gave Prime Minister a fair chance to engage it. It's not new material. It was in a debate in my POI. Of course, because it was only there for 15 seconds, it might be weak. It might not be a very well-proven argument, and we'll treat it as such. But we can definitely give it credit, even if the member did not speak of it, and not treat it as new material. Let's note on holistic adjudication. Holistic adjudication also means that there is no heuristic or scheme that can replace judgment. We don't count the number of points teams give. We don't count the number of clashes they win. It is entirely possible for one team to win one clash and the other team to win two clashes, and the team that won only one clash win the debate because it was the more important clash. We don't look at how content is branded. I don't care if it's broken apart to 5 points or 1 point. I only care about its qualitative strength. Is this clear? Are there any questions? Okay. More on holistic adjudication. A call can never be explained by saying a team takes the fourth because they didn't. Oh, wait, this is already not about holistic adjudication. This is a mistake in the slide. I apologize. This is about comparative adjudication, just to not confuse you. A call can never be a team takes the fourth because they didn't have good engagement, or a team takes the first because they had very good analysis. None of these statements mean anything in a vacuum. The question always has to be how they fare in comparison to other teams. This is why we don't have automatic firsts or automatic fourths. We only have positions in comparative to other positions. So even if a team had very bad analysis, they could still win the debate if they had better analysis than the other teams, because everyone was very bad. This is also relevant for you as panelists when you're trying to contribute to the deliberation or get good feedback from your chair. And I notice this a lot when I'm chairing and I'm asking my panelists to justify their calls. I would ask them, why do you think CO loses to CG, for example? And they would say something like, I don't think CO proves their case. This is fine, but it doesn't answer my question. Even if CO didn't prove their case, it does not say they lose to CG. Maybe CG also didn't prove their case. Maybe CO did very effective rebuttal to CG. It does not answer my question if it doesn't give me any comparative reason for why CO is worse comparatively than CG. So calls have to always be comparative. The best way to ensure we are being comparative is using clashes. I don't want to get too deeply into this because clashes are a whole workshop of itself. But if you are not familiar with the term, clashes are core questions in disagreement in the debate. So, for example, if we have the motion this House would legalize all drugs, usually we would have the following clashes. One, will the regulated market be better than the black market? Two, do people freely choose and enact autonomy when consuming drugs? Or do they fall victims to pressures and misinformation and don't actually have a valid autonomous choice? And three, is the choice to consume drugs only a personal choice, or does it have significant enough externalities on society for us to intervene? When I divide the debate into these clashes, I can often put all of the arguments each team gave in direct contrasting one versus the other. And because it is always easier to compare apples and apples and oranges to oranges than it is to compare apples to oranges, say, needing to consider the value of OG's contribution on the black market versus Oak's contribution on choice, I would rather divide all of the material into clashes to see the direct comparisons where teams directly clash, and it's much easier for me to be comparative in deciding who wins each question. I will, of course, then still need to decide which of the clashes are most important. I'll have a slide about that in the end of the workshop. Lastly, comparisons between teams are independent. This means we cannot say something like, well, CO didn't rebut OG, but OO already took down all of OG's material, so OG fell out of the comparison and CO doesn't need to engage them. We now just need to weigh CO's constructive material against OO's. This is not how we judge. We do not credit CO for a rebuttal OO gave. When CO come up, we ignore what OO has already said, and we open a blank slate comparing OG to CO. Now, crucially, there is a distinction here. Obviously, calls in debate are still transitive, and therefore, a third team's material can indirectly impact comparison between two teams. I'll give two classic examples of this. One, if CO repeats word by word what OO said, obviously, I will not credit this as extension, also when comparing CO to OG or to CG. Although it is technically inserting a third team into the comparison, because what does OO have to do in the comparison between OG and CO? Because I cannot give credit to CO for what OO has already said. Similarly, if OG beats OO and CO beats OG, it is definitely relevant to placing CO over OO. When I will then compare the opposition bench, I will not just look at the vacuum at who had better material. I am also looking at who engaged the debate better. So this is also a case where I can insert a third team into a comparison. As a rule of thumb, to simplify how we think about comparisons being independent, the rule is we only give teams credit for things they and they alone contributed, which means we do not credit repetitions, and which means we do not credit for a comparison that was already won. This is why if OO already won OG, CO can still lose to OG, because we do not credit CO for OO's win. We only credit each team for its own direct contributions. Questions so far? Okay, moving on. Non-interventionism. This is the third first principle of judging. Judging is holistic, judging is comparative, and judging is non-interventionist. This means we are trying to be as objective as possible when evaluating the debate. What does objective mean in the context of non-interventionism principle? There is the obvious element of objective, which is what we discussed already when we discussed the globally informed voter. That is, we do not insert our own beliefs into the judging. We probably have an opinion about the motion in many cases. We might be pro-choice or pro-life, left-wing or right-wing, capitalist or socialist or anything you want, but this should not matter. That much is obvious, and I think most people understand this without many misunderstandings. However, being non-interventionist goes a step farther. It does not only mean that we do not intervene in a broad opinion we hold. It also means we do not intervene in types of argumentation that we personally find more compelling or more intuitive because of our own biases. For example, I might be a utilitarian. I might believe in the real world, practical impacts are always more important than principles. I should not judge a debate like this, even though it is not a political opinion, because you can be pragmatic both about left-wing and right-wing. This is still a bias that is inserting my own views into the debate. An even more nuanced example would be, say that there is an argument I've heard a gazillion times already before, and therefore I know very well why it is true. For example, let's say a team gave the argument that people don't vote on issues such as the environment because it is not high in their intensity of preferences. This is an assertion. Many of you might think of this as something you can accept because many of you already know the analysis behind the intensity of preferences. But the fact that you know the analysis does not change the fact that the team did not give it. They need to explain what intensity of preferences mean and how when voters go to the ballots, they have to choose a party that represents a basket of policies, and they cannot cherry pick and choose their preferences on econ and their preferences on security and their preferences on the environment. This forces them to prioritize the main issues they vote on and makes other issues fall below the threshold of having too low intensity of preferences, which would mean even if I'm an environmentalist, I care more about the economic policy of a party than its climate policy, and this is why I will almost never vote on the environment. This is analysis. Now I explained what intensity of preferences mean. But just saying intensity of preferences, no matter how familiar you're with it, is not analysis. The same applies for every common mechanism that you have heard a gazillion times if you do not get analysis for it. Take, for example, optimism bias. You might think things don't have to prove optimism bias because everyone knows people have optimism bias. This is false. Why? Because everyone also knows people have risk aversion, which is the opposite of optimism bias. So what is it going to be? If I'm going to choose whether or not to invest my money in a stock, am I going to have optimism bias and therefore put all of my money in Bitcoin, believing I'll be rich? Or am I going to be risk averse and put all of my money in the bank, not investing anything because I fear losing it all? The actual analytical logic behind optimism bias or risk aversion would help us determine how people would act in every given situation. But the real answer is in the real world, people don't always have optimism bias, nor do they always have risk aversion. It very much depends and varies by person to person and case by case. We have to prove that in the context of this debate, people will have optimism bias. So the fact that some jargon is very popular to the extent that it is extremely intuitive to people does not mean that we credit the full extent of it without people explaining why we should. Same goes for comparative advantage. Same goes for any type of commonly run argument. To be clear, being non-interventionist is true for any type of content. This means if analysis is not given, we do not fill it in. And if it is given, we do not refute it if teams did not refute it within the debate. It also means if teams gave rebuttals, if the rebuttal is sufficient within the debate, even if I can easily think of a rebuilding for it and how I could reconstruct the case after it, if the team didn't rebuild, I'm crediting the rebuttal. Same applies for weighings. Even if I personally don't buy a weighing at all, I think it's stupid. If a team gave a weighing and analyzed it, I would be interventionist if I would discredit it just because I don't personally believe it. Take a classic example. Say the motion is, this house would allow fathers to opt out of legal rights and obligations to their children or to their child in the case that they wish for an abortion and their pregnant spouse refuses an abortion. Traditionally, we would have three main stakeholders in this debate. The fathers and how the motion impacts them and their rights, the mothers, and the children. Now, I don't know you guys personally, but if you're similar to most debaters and perhaps most people in the real world, I would assume that your intuitive scale of how you would rank these different stakeholders would place the baby or the child as the most important stakeholder. Second place would probably be the mother, although this would already be a bit more controversial, and father would come last. I think this would be this kind of scale that a lot of people would use. Say, however, that proposition, after proving that the motion is going to protect fathers' rights for autonomy, has given several weighings for why we should care about the father as the most important stakeholder in this debate. Because they are the most directly impacted, because there are alternatives for the mother and the child, such as the welfare system, whereas there's no alternative for the father to get their autonomy back, because one's right to autonomy and freedom from being a parent is more important than just the right for financial benefits that you get from an unwanted father, and so on. I can think of many more reasons of how I would analyze this weighing. The weighing might not convince you in the real world. You might still believe the father's rights are less important than the baby's rights. But if this is the only weighing given in the debate, it is analyzed, and it is never refuted, I would probably accept it. There is no reason I should discredit this weighing just because I don't personally agree with it or because I could think of a counter weighing that no one ever gave. Discrediting a weighing because we find it unconvincing to us is just the same as discrediting an argument just because we find it unconvincing to us. So every piece of content in the debate is treated without interventionism. Now, here is where some things get tricky. This does not mean that everything said in the debate should automatically be credited to its fullest extent if it is not refuted, which is how some people interpret non-interventionism. Let's say proposition just said the father is the most important stakeholder, but gave zero reasons why. I'm still not going to credit it, even if position never refuted it and never engaged this weighing, because the weighing was never proven from the get-go. Similarly, with analysis, say that proposition said, if we break up NATO, then immediately Russia will nuke Ukraine, and they give no analysis for it. The fact that opposition did not refute it does not mean that we need to give it the full credit and give them the credit for the impact of the nuclear war in Ukraine. So how do we do it? What does it mean to be non-interventionist but still discredit arguments that are not proven. Isn't it interventionist? Just because we weren't convinced, they said it, no one refuted it. The answer is we only credit everything that is said to the extent that it is proven. Filling in analysis that was not given is also interventionist. So if the team said that because of the reduction of the deterrence from NATO, Russia will now start a nuclear war, I am crediting it exactly to the extent it was proven, which is a possibility. It might be that because of this, Russia will start a nuclear war. But given no reasons for the likelihood, I would not credit it as likely just because it went unrefuted. This is, by the way, also why being concrete when we justify our calls is important, meaning using material from within the debate. A very common thing I see in judges' oral adjudications, which are not very good to explain the calls to teams and convince them, or to maximize your feedback, is judges saying vague abstractions, such as CG won OG because they had much better analysis. What was much better about their analysis? What concretely did they say that was better from OG and why? Refer back to the debate to show that you are not being interventionist and judging based on your own intuition, but rather only judge based on material from within the debate. Any questions on non-interventionism in debate? Okay, so no questions, moving on. How do we write when we judge? Hold on, I see something in the chat. Okay, I'm going to read out the question because it was sent to me privately, and to answer it, I want people to know what I'm answering. The question reads, in the torture motion example, can judges intervene by saying that Op says terrorists might lie, but it is fair to say that the police don't use this information even without government's rebuttal? So the answer is no. However, if proposition does not rebut opposition's material on why torture is unreliable source of information, we have to credit it as standing to the extent that it was proven. But surely, even if proposition did not have any engagement with opposition, they had their own constructive arguments. And when I compare between props material and ops material, I would consider the relative low degree of relevance of ops argument, although prop did not point it out, when comparing it to prop's argument. I am not discrediting or ignoring the argument because I personally find it not that relevant if no one points it out. But when I'm comparing different material, I will consider how strong the material is in a vacuum, and how strong it is does take into consideration also its relevance. Does this answer the question? Okay. Let's then move on to writing. Few general observations on what we should write. One, and the most obvious, we should write what speakers say in the debate. We need to track the content in order to be able to judge it. Two, we should write what we think about what speakers say. This is important. I want to slow down on that element for a second. Judging happens from the moment the debate began. Judging does not start when deliberation starts. If you've ever been in a deliberation panel, you would know that it is 15 minutes, starting with the chair saying, take 2 minutes to go over your notes, and then I will ask you for your initial calls. If anyone here thinks they can reach the right call for a 1 hour long debate in 2 minutes, they're crazy. It's not how it's done. You are meant to already have a rough idea of the call when the debate is over, even before these 2 minutes. You are not meant to use these 2 minutes to just now go over all the content and start comparing. You are comparing on the go as the debate progresses. This means that when we judge, despite being non-interventionist, we are not just passive listeners writing what people say like speech-to-text algorithms. We already proactively think of what it means for the call. Does this rebuttal engage the analysis that they gave earlier, or does it miss part of the analysis, or does it strawman the argument? Is this argument really proving its basic premise? All of these thoughts that I have about how different content pertains to the call, I'm going to note down during the debate. I want to have a quick summary of my thoughts ready by the end of the debate. And this is the main thing I would go over in those 2 minutes to go over my notes in the end. When OG and OO are done talking, I am meant to already have an idea of who wins the top half. So that when CG comes up, I now know where I want to place them in comparison to top half. So say, if OO won OG, and I am seeing CG is now already being very strong relative to OO and giving very, very potent rebuttals to it, I am noting to myself, if this works, and if they are successful in eliminating OO, they are also over OG, and I don't need to make this comparison directly. I am constantly looking through my notes while I judge to try and get to the right call as the debate progresses. This also means we write down everything that adds new content, even if we don't know yet why it is valuable. Often teams will do a lot of setup or characterization that on face value doesn't sound relevant. The problem is we don't know yet what is relevant, both because they didn't tie it yet to their bottom line, we might understand it later on, and because we don't know yet what other teams are going to do with it. I'll give you an example. Say the motion is, this house would legalize sex work. And proposition starts analyzing why sex work today, when it is unregulated, is really, really terrible and exploitative and coercive. I might think this is off clash intuitively. I might think, who is going to contest this? Surely ops' incentive is to concede that sex work is exploitative. They would only disagree on whether legalizing and regulating it would solve it. They would claim it's inherently exploitative. So why are you wasting time, Prime Minister? Go on and analyze the solution. But this is not an excuse to not write down their analysis of the problem. Because sometimes LO would surprise you and come up and say, we do not think there is a problem of a black market in the status quo at all. We do not think that today anyone who does not want to engage in sex work engages in sex work. And suddenly it becomes a clash. We don't know actually what teams will or will not challenge. So things that seem intuitively irrelevant might become relevant throughout the debate. So we try and write down everything that might be valuable later. How should we write? So this is part of the trickiness of it. There are a few challenges to address when writing. One, on the one hand, we want to track as much content as possible. Teams hate it when we ignore their material. We have to notice everything that is said. On the other hand, we are but humans. We cannot write that fast as people speak. Not to mention, even if we do, it would make our sheets so full of words that it would be impossible to go over all of it to get our call later. So we need to balance out the need to be inclusive of all material in the debate, with the need to be concise in how we write. Here, there are a few guidelines that can help you. And I will say there is not a right way to do note-taking and tracking. And if you look at the first module of the Korea Judge Training Program, it is all about tracking, and it gives you examples of different judges and how they take their notes, including online and on the sheet. So you might find some systems that are more convenient for you personally. However, some guidelines are almost always useful. One, remember that this is for you. It is not for anyone else to read. It is not an assignment that you're going to hand in to your professor at university to grade. So don't bother so much with full sentences, accurate words, or grammar. If Prime Minister says, "Dear panel, the global poor are shackled by the chains of no choice under capitalism." This is a long sentence. I can just write, "Capitalism restricts choice for workers." That is enough. I don't need all of it. I don't need connecting terms and connecting words and so on. It is completely fine if I reduce content to be smaller, as long as I don't miss content or logic, but just words. This is particularly also relevant when people use grandiose words when they don't need to. If a speaker said the word preposterous to describe a certain impact, I will very often just write on my sheet, bad, because it takes me much less time and space to write bad than preposterous. And it usually has no meaning for the content, but only for the rhetorics. So you can usually write much less words than speakers say. Secondly, not everything that was said is necessary to write, only everything that is necessary for you to remember the case. Sometimes just writing an example to flag back something that was said is going to be enough to remind you the analysis. Again, we are not writing this essay for someone else to read, but only to remind yourself what was said. I will give you an example. Say that the motion is, this house would give a copyright for art produced using AI generators. Say that I am proposition, and op said something around the lines of, if people get copyright for content produced in AI generative algorithms, it would copyright too many things that people should not have a right to, because anyone can take a random picture, even one drawn by a different artist, put it as a prompt to the algorithm and say, draw something similar. And they added zero value and zero creativity to it. But now you give them copyright over it and harm anyone else who wants to use the same picture. Say that proposition gives the following analysis in response. Panel, judges are not stupid. The problem opposition describes exists in every copyright issue, because copyright is always a spectrum of how much ingenuity you have and how much copying you have. For example, if a photographer takes a photo of vodka Smirnoff bottle for an advertisement, they may claim property rights, copyright, for their photo. But we all know that each of you is allowed to use stock images of vodka Smirnoff bottles, take your own pictures of vodka Smirnoff. This is because the judges know to not give them credit for every picture in the world of vodka Smirnoff, but only for their specific unique additions, the unique angles and lighting that they use. So only their specific picture is copyrighted, but not everything else. Similarly, with generative AI, it is likely to be deemed that you get copyright for the specific ingenuity and creativity you add, say if you write something special in the prompt, but not for any element that is not originally yours. This was a long explanation, but I would bet for many judges, if they just write the vodka Smirnoff analysis, they would remember what it refers to. Even though it doesn't write down any of the mechanisms or explanations, because presumably not many other people speak about vodka Smirnoff in this debate, you're likely to remember what it said, which is, by the way, part of why examples are powerful and help judges remember better content. So you don't have to write necessarily the full case. You just need to write enough to remind you everything important that was said in it. Lastly, you can also replace common terms with abbreviations and symbols. The letters SQ are something I constantly use instead of status quo. The letters SA change their meaning for me between a debate and another debate. Sometimes SA means Saudi Arabia. Sometimes it means South Africa. Sometimes it means South America. Sometimes it means sexual assaults. It is fine for my abbreviations to change from a debate to a debate. As long as I know what they mean, I can use them. Similarly, if a team says something like a marginal increasing returns, I can just write small arrow returns. And I know the arrow means increasing because it's more short for me to write an arrow than write increasing. So you can do any type of symbol as long as you understand it. That's the only thing that matters in your note-taking, that it is clear and structured for you. How do we structure our sheets? Actually, before I get to structuring sheets, do you have broad questions on what we write or how we should write? Let me see in the chat. Okay, I'll say a few things. One, I would recommend don't speak too fast. I don't like this trend too much in debate. It is indeed judges' responsibility to do their best efforts to track even if you speak fast. But I genuinely think most people are not just more convincing, but more efficient when they speak slower. Speaking fast is mostly a bad habit that makes you not learn to speak efficiently. Just learn how to say the same with less words. However, insofar as it is inevitable for you to speak fast, consider how judges take notes and make it less likely for them to miss important stuff. Use a lot of examples and intuition pumps, which make it easy to remember your material. Be very structured. Use clear bottom lines. Slow down in selective parts. Even if you cannot speak slowly throughout your speech, at least slow down when you reach your bottom line so that the most important parts they get. Okay, any other questions on how we should write? Okay, let's talk then more specific structure of our sheets when we take notes. Now, I want to make a caveat for a second. There is no one right way to structure our sheets. I don't want anyone to go around saying, Hadar said this has to be the way you write your sheets, otherwise it's bad judging. Different judges have different structures, and it's perfectly fine. I'm going to give some general suggestions that I think will be useful in all different types of structure. And then I'll tell you how I specifically structure my sheets. But if you find a different structure that works for you, that is fine. But I would say, as a general thing that I highly recommend, and I think every very good judge that I know uses it, despite all of them having very different structures for their sheets. Have a meta sheet. What do I mean? Don't just track what speakers say and in the same sheet write your thoughts on what they say. In addition to this, have a sheet that is used to write for yourself a summary of your thoughts. What is this going to be used for? Again, we want to judge the debate proactively throughout, and we want to be able to efficiently go over our notes by the end of the debate when we have 2 minutes at the beginning of deliberation. To that end, we want to have a shorter version of the debate and the important comparisons accessible to us. Think of this similar to how in many textbooks you have in the opening a table of contents that tells you the main chapters in the book and where you can find them. If you ever had an exam with open material, you might know that you don't flip through a full book during an exam that has a 2-hour time limit, but you look through the contents and through your checklist and only read quick summaries. And only when you need extra detail on something specific, you will go to where the table of contents tell you to search for it. But you never flip through the full book. Similarly, we would rarely flip through 8 speeches in 2 minutes. It is unhuman to do that. So we want to create our own sort of table of contents that allows us to more efficiently see the debate at a broad, simplified picture, and that is allowing us to more efficiently flag back from the summary sheet back to the content if we want to find more details. This is why I recommend, in addition to tracking the content, have a sheet to track the meta of the debate, the structure of the debate. My recommendation, and how I usually do this, is the following. My meta sheet usually has 2 parts. At the top, I have an extremely brief summary of what each of the 4 teams said. You can see it in this over here. In this, I will not write analysis. I would only write bottom lines and how well I think they are proven. So if OG had 3 bottom lines, I will write 1, 2, 3 bottom lines, and next to each of them, I would write a V if I think it's proven, an X if I think it's not proven, and a question mark if I think it's unclear if it's sufficiently proven and I want to think about it more. This allows me to remember broadly what OG says, and of course it does not mean I ignore analysis. I judge based on analysis. Bottom lines alone don't win debate. But I've already evaluated if it's sufficiently proven or not when they said it. So I know I already thought this is sufficiently proven and I don't need to go back to it. Whereas if something else has a question mark and I think I'm not sure, I will know then I need to flag back to OG's material to this specific point to look through the analysis they gave for it and see if I find it sufficient now after I've heard all of the positions and rebuttals. I often also write specifically where it flags back to. So for example, next to the 3 bottom lines of OG, I will write PM, PM, DPM. So I know in exactly which speeches to look back later if I need more information or details about it. The second part of my meta sheet is a clashes sheet. This is where I track the main clashes in the debate. And underneath each clash, I write a summary of what each team said under the clash. So here, I would take the bottom lines OG said, but also the important rebuttals OO gave, and write them accordingly under OG or OO under the relevant clash that they pertain to. And this overview in the end of the debate will allow me to make assessment of who I think wins each clash, to be followed by which clash I think is most important. So this is how I personally like doing my meta sheet. As for the content sheets, I would generally recommend use some form of a table, like a chart, where you have prop on one side and up on the other side. It is not mandatory. You can theoretically do a full sheet that is for each speech. The only downside is it makes it harder to do the process of proactively judging during the debate. As I said earlier, because we want to reach a call during the debate, when OO is giving a rebuttal, like when LO is rebutting PM, I already want to look back at PM's analysis and ask, Is this engaging the analysis? Is it strawmanning it? Is it sufficient or missing analysis? And when they stand one by another, it's much easier for me to do this comparison. I often also directly draw arrows to see what engages what to make it easier for me to follow what I want to look for in the engagement. This is why I recommend using some form of a chart. In terms of how many speeches to include per page, this is fully individual. This is based on how tidy and how small you write your notes. I usually have 2 speeches per page, meaning PMLO is 1 sheet. DPM-DLO is a 2nd sheet. Many people do 4 speeches per page. Some people do 1. This is entirely subjective and there is no right or wrong answer to it. It's only based on how condensed your writing is. My last general recommendation for note-taking, I would strongly recommend make it somehow clear and visible what is content that speakers say and what are comments that you have as thoughts in the debate. I like color coding. I write in black what speakers say as content and in red my thoughts on it. Some people hate working with colors. Especially, I noticed a lot of people who work on typing rather than writing, like do it online on a laptop. Often changing the font color is too slow to do because you don't have command prompts for it in your keyboard unless you explicitly define them. And it is easier for them to do something like bold or unbold. That's just Control B, or underline, and so on. So some people like just doing all caps, bigger letters, underlining, circle, whatever works. Find what's more convenient for you to write, as long as you have some means of noticing immediately for first sight what is content that speakers said and what you had in the debate. This will also make it easier to more efficiently go over your notes and the important parts later. Any questions on how to structure our sheets? Okay. I am now going to discuss more in depth the situation of close calls. Hold on, I'm seeing something in the chat. I write all 3 sheets simultaneously, yes. My method is usually, I start by writing everything Prime Minister says, because before they're done, I cannot know what the clashes are. When they're done, I write a brief summary that's usually like 2 sentences only in my summary sheet of here's what the bottom lines of Prime Minister were. When LO speaks, I start noticing proactively whenever a clash is opened. They rebut something Prime Minister said, boom, we have a clash. I'm now writing first clash on my clashes sheet, and from this moment on, everything anyone says that pertains to this clash, I write a summary of under this clash. A new clash opens, clash number 2. From that moment on, everything anyone adds relevant to this clash, I write directly to that clash sheet. Does that answer the question? Okay. I'm going to separate the situation of close calls to 2 common situations. One is when teams are engaging on competing metrics, and it does not matter if it's competing metrics because prop ran one metric and op ran another metric, or if it's because OG ran one bottom line and CG ran another bottom line. These would be competing metrics or competing clashes that I need to evaluate between what is more important. The second situation of close calls will be inside the same clash, such as if OG and OO both engage on the same metric but have wishy-washy competing analysis, and I need to decide who wins the clash. So I'll go one by one through these types of close comparisons. Close calls with competing metrics. There are many ways in which we can decide which clash or which metric is more important. These ways are not made equal, however. Some ways are preferential to other ways. The preference or the hierarchy of weighings, the hierarchy of how we prioritize which weighing to use, is directly stemming from the first principles of adjudication we discussed earlier, from being non-interventionist, holistic, and comparative. The best metric, which is not often available, but if available is the best, is considered metrics within the debate. If both teams in a given comparison say the words, the most important question in this debate is where do we get more money? That's it. There's an agreement. I just need to compare who had better analysis and where do we get more money. I no longer care if one of the teams won another clash because everyone in the debate now agrees on the metric. Now, concessions can be explicit or implicit. Be careful when you rely on implicit concessions. It does not mean ignore them, but only consider them as concessions if you are certain that they were actually conceded. I'll give you an example of what to do and what not to do. Say that both teams didn't explicitly say what they agree on. However, it is a necessary premise for both of their arguments that they agree on it. For example, if the motion is, this house, as the LGBT community, would cancel Pride, say that OG analyzes why Pride is good for the perception of, why Pride is bad for the perception of the LGBT community. It is antagonizing and causing backlash because it's overly sexual and whatnot. OO analyzes Pride is good for the perception of the LGBT community. In this case, they both concede two things. One, they definitely concede that Pride has an impact. They can't now come up and say what OG says makes no sense because no one even bases their opinion on the LGBT community based on Pride. Because in order for any of these impacts to happen, they have to agree there's a difference. And two, they both concede that the metric of perception of the community is important. And if this is their only case, they implicitly concede that they find it the most important metric. However, say that OO had a second case, which says, even if Pride is worse for people's perception of the LGBT community, it is still important internally for the community. Because even if haters are gonna hate, for the small queer child who is still in the closet, it means the world to be able to see so many others who already went out of the closet and see them living their true selves happily. And this gives them a sense of community and comfort. Let's say that OO spent 5 minutes of LO speech, or even more than that. They had 2 speeches, 14 minutes in total. Let's say that out of these 14 minutes, they spent 10 minutes analyzing how it impacts other people's perception of the community, and only 4 minutes analyzing how it impacts queer people's feelings inside the community. I've heard many judges use the heuristic that because they spoke about the internal effects for only 4 minutes and about the external effects for 10 minutes, they implicitly concede that the external effects are more important. This is false. Time spent on a point is not an implicit concession. It is possible they spent more time on the first point because that one is in more direct engagement and clash with OG, and they wanted to rebut OG and spend more time on that. But they might still think that the second point is more important. So don't assume an implicit concession based on heuristics unless it is clearly evident from the points. But insofar as a concession is clear, I don't care if I find something else more convincing anymore. I don't want to insert myself. Everyone in the debate agrees. I agree with them. Say that everyone in the debate agrees that Trump winning is the worst impact and the winning team would be the one to prove that Trump is least likely to win. Even if I think it's not important and I don't care about who wins the elections, I still need to judge based on what happened in the debate, independent of what I view is important. So first hierarchy, conceded metric. Second hierarchy, teams disagree on which metric is more important, which is the more common case. The second best option is proven weighings from within the debate. This goes back to what we said earlier about non-interventionism. Even if I have a separate weighing I can think of to decide which clash is more important, or I think the globally informed voter intuitively cares more about one clash than another, say they care more about children than fathers. If a team gave and analyzed proven weighing within the debate, I am not meant to insert another weighing that was not said in the debate. I would always prioritize material inside the debate over material outside of the debate. If competing weighings exist, this is fine. We just treat it as another clash. There's now a meta clash on what's the metric to judge the debate. And I will write down every piece of weighing people say under this clash to later decide who wins the weighing clash. But whoever wins the weighing clash will determine which of the other clashes I prioritize. This is, for example, common in debates about actor motions, because usually actor motions are about the actor incentives. What do we as an actor care about more? So if the motion is something like, this house as a vegan will constantly and annoyingly preach everyone in their environment to become a vegan. Let's say that prop has a strong argument on why this will be effective in converting people to veganism, and op has a strong proven argument on why this will lose friends for us. And then DPN gives analysis on why we as vegans care most about animal rights, and DLO gives a competing weighing of why we still care most about our own friendships more than we care about our impact on animal welfare. I will now look at the clash. There is now a clash on what is the main incentive of the actor. And I will compare the analysis on both sides and the refutations to these weighings and decide who proves their metric better, and accordingly decide which argument should win. So second in the hierarchy of weighings is proven weighings from within the debate. Thirdly, say that no one weighs within the debate. I cannot only decide based on direct material within the debate. I still prefer being non-interventionist. So the next best thing, in order to not decide based on what I or anyone else subjectively thinks is more important, is to compare based on non-subjective questions. These are questions that evaluate the quality of analysis, as opposed to evaluating which bottom line is more important. Say that we are in the debate about fathers opting out from their moral rights and from their legal rights and obligations to a child. Say OG proved decisively that this will help fathers defend their right to autonomy, and OO proved decisively that it will hurt children who will now become fatherless and lose alimony. I now need to weigh between these arguments, and no one weighed within the debate what is more important. I am not yet asking myself what the globally informed voter thinks is more important, because again, this is not a consensus. There might be a preference, there might be a direction in which most voters tilt, but it is not a clear-cut answer. So both arguments are valid and could be debate winning. So my next best thing is to look at who won their clash better. Remember what I said at the beginning of this workshop about asking whether the apple is appleier or the orange is orangier? Same thing applies for competing metrics in debate. If OG proved that the extent of benefit the motion does to the father is huge, and OO proved a small extent of benefit to the child, I don't need to address the question of who is more important, the father or the child, because OG wins their clash by a knockout and OO win their clash by a small margin. So the third best metric of comparison, if teams don't weigh within the debate, that still doesn't force me to use any material external to the debate, is quality of analysis, in which we will consider all three components of the analysis: likelihood, importance, and relevance. Fourthly, say that teams did not weigh, have competing metrics, and they also have very similar degrees of analysis on their metrics. Each team wins their clash by a similar margin. Then the next best thing is the globally informed voter. I don't insert still my personal beliefs. That I never do. I ask myself, what would an objective, globally informed voter believe? And I would only revert to it if I'm sure I know what their answer is, if I think it is clear cut. If I think I'm not sure, if there's a chance that I might be inserting my own biases here, and that I'm assuming the globally informed voter just agrees with me, I would avoid that. The last metric of comparison, if all else fails, is who had more chance of engagement. This is why we say, for example, bottom half teams have a bigger burden of weighing than top half teams, because they had more of the chance to weigh. This is basically saying all else equal and no one weighs, because one team had more of an opportunity to weigh because they already heard the other team's material, and the other had less of an opportunity to weigh because they finished speaking before the other side presented their material, I would opt for the team that had less chance to engage, because I penalize more the team that did not engage. I want to flag here to a question I saw on the sheet that I got. Someone asked, what is the burden of weighing on bottom half teams? I think this is something that is sometimes overblown. Bottom half teams have a higher burden, but not an absolute burden of weighing. Bottom half teams can still win top half teams without a single word of weighing. Remember, chance of engagement is the last resort metric of weighing in the hierarchy of weighings. We would prefer any of the others. If bottom half team just had clearly better analysis on the metric that top half conceded, or if they had clearly better analysis on their metric than the top half team had on their metric, or the global informed voter clearly thinks their argument is more important, I would still give it to bottom half, even if they did not actively weigh. The only chance in which I would take down a team for chance of engagement is if literally everything else is equal. Is this clear? Are there any questions? Okay. If no questions, I'll move on to close calls with the same metric. This might be a bit confusing in abstract. I'll start by giving the general guidelines, and then I'll show you an example. But let's start with the guidelines. How do close calls on the same metric look like, and why do they confuse people? It is usually a tight clash with a lot of material back and forth from both teams on the same clash. And I have a lot of competing analysis to start comparing, and both of them may have had good analysis. And how do I decide which is better? Here, I would usually do the following 3 steps. 1, I start by narrowing down the quantity of material I need to address. When I have packed sheets with so much content, it is very hard to get to an answer. But the truth is, a lot of the material teams say inside clashes is not actually important to determine the clash. What I ask myself is, within the clash, what are the sub-clashes? Within the clash, what do teams agree on, and what do teams disagree on? I only need to compare what teams disagree on, and this can make my life significantly easier. Let's look at an example. Let's say the motion is, this house believes that the EU should form a standing army, meaning a conjoined EU army of all European countries forming an army alliance together. Let's look at the following exchange that we might get from OG and OO. OG says, a European army will deter Russia from further expansion into Eastern Europe. Because When all countries in Europe share their resources, their intelligence, and their manpower, it will allow for a very powerful military. Secondly, Russia knows it is enough to attack just one country in Europe to trigger the armies of all of them, so it won't dare get anywhere near. Thirdly, it is a military that can go across borders throughout Europe. And so it is very mobile and powerful, and it makes the logistics of giving them supplies and ammunition during warfare much more easy. Fourthly, each country has its own comparative advantage. Possibly Germany has better intelligence, and Poland has maybe more manpower and whatnot. And if we combine all of these comparative advantages together, we will create an army that is properly to fear of. Lastly, European countries face no immediate threat from any other actor. So Russia has to know this army is going to concentrate all of its power against Russia alone if tensions arise. So it has good reasons to be afraid. OO says a European army will only exacerbate and escalate because it would trigger more Russian aggression. One, because it is just on the border of some of Russia's strategic allies, like in the Baltics. It is something Russia really dislikes to have a strong army so close to its border. Two, images and news of the army, its drills and its growing power will spread and cause fear and unease in Russia, creating more pressure to do something to fight back. Thirdly, Russia knows it won't be able to win this army in the long run. The EU is technologically superior and richer, so it would be very opposed to such an army. Fourthly, this army is likely to be backed by NATO and the US, making it even more intimidating. Russia can't let it slide, just like it did not let it slide when Ukraine positioned NATO missile bases on its border. Fifthly, the EU has no other immediate threats. Russia knows this army is meant to be against it. It will not take kindly to this message. Sixthly, it takes time to build an army. Russia will take advantage of the momentum and strike to prevent it before it gets too powerful. This is a very obvious clash on will a European army deter or aggregate Russia? And there's a lot of competing analysis here. This may seem crammed and very hard to evaluate. But actually, if you look closer, it is extremely easy to judge. And it is a fairly clear-cut 0-0 win. The reason for this is simple. Most of these mechanisms on both sides are not actually in disagreement. The vast majority of the mechanisms both OG and OO give are reasons for why a European army will be strong and scary. The only disagreement they have is on whether this army being strong and scary would be responded to by deterrence or aggression. What is the likely response of Russia to threat? I don't need to decide what to do with all of this material that proves something both sides agree on. I can erase 90% of this material and ignore it because both sides agree this is a powerful and scary military. I only need to notice which of these mechanisms are actually pertaining to the question in disagreement. And here, there is mostly one mechanism that is most unclash, and it comes late in 00. And this is when they say it will take time to build such an army because Russia is already threatened by it. So the deterrence and escalation already exists because it's opposed to it, but is not yet deterred from acting because the military is not yet founded. and therefore it is not yet fearing that it will not be able to win, it is likelier that Russia's response will be aggression rather than deterrence. This is, by the way, applicable in very, very many similar clashes in other IR debates. In fact, we use the exact same strategy in the recent worlds to win the motion about should Japan or do we support Japan's remilitarization? When there was obviously a clash about will Japan's remilitarization create deterrence or escalation in their relations with China? And the main analysis we use from up is we agree Japan will have a very strong military that could deter China, but it still doesn't. And when China knows it is aiming for one, it would try to prevent it now before it's too late. So this is something you can very frequently do in very washed and crammed clashes. Not every piece of material in a crammed clash is actually important to determine who wins it. Identify which material is in agreement and which is in disagreement. Marker it. You only need to compare the material in disagreement. Then, when we compare the material in disagreement, we have an easier life. First, we want to identify what is in direct engagement and what is in competing analysis. If a team gives a direct refutation within the same clash, it makes my life easy. When I compare the refutation with the original material, I only need to answer one question. Does this refutation suffice to take down the original mechanism? The more tricky thing is if the analysis is competing. Say, if Trump analyzes Russia's response to threat is likelier to be of deterrence rather than of escalation, because in the short run, Russia is extremely weak. Because after the war in Ukraine, it has lost a lot of manpower, its economy is in the brinks, and so on. So despite being angered by it, it would be too afraid of losing another battle if it opens another fight. And this is why the result will be deterrence rather than escalation. And OO gives the competing mechanism of Russia knows now, in the short run, the military is still weak by the EU, but if it doesn't act now in the short run, it will become too strong. So it would be pressured to act now and be aggressive. This is competing analysis. No one rebuts each other. And this is the hardest comparison. Now I just have to assess which of these mechanisms is more compelling. Which of the competing mechs under the same clash is more compelling? And this I will do similar to how I compare between clashes. I will ask which mechanism is better analyzed, which mechanism is better weighed, which mechanism does the globally informed voter think is intuitively stronger, and so on. But the trick is to make my life easier, to narrow down how many comparisons like this I need to make. If I just need to compare one competing mechanism to another, it will not take much time. The problem people usually have with washed, crammed clashes is when they try to address everything. This is why the narrowing down process is important. I first start by ignoring everything that both sides agree on, and I go on by taking out the easy points of what is directly refuted. I am then left with a small list of competing mechs on each side, and now I only need to evaluate between them. That would be it. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Seems like no questions, in which case we can call this workshop to an end, and I guess